A homeless man asks for $1. But what Melania Trump does next leaves everyone speechless. The wind had a sharp bite that evening in downtown Dallas. The streets were alive with their usual rhythm, commuters hurrying home, street vendors calling out, the occasional blare of a car horn. Among the crowd, a man sat slumped on the corner of Main and Harwood. His coat was threadbare, patched at the elbows, and his boots barely held together by scraps of tape. His name was Roy, though few bothered to ask. Roy had been living on the streets for 3 years. Once a carpenter, he'd lost everything after a workplace injury. No job, no insurance, no home. The holidays were the hardest. Memories of his daughter's laughter and the scent of his wife's apple pie haunted him. Tonight, though, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the gnawing hunger in his belly and the few coins in his cup. Enough for half a sandwich, maybe. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes caught on a tall figure in a beige trench coat. Her walk was deliberate but unhurried. She wore dark sunglasses despite the fading light, and her hair framed her face in a way that seemed oddly familiar. He squinted, trying to place her, but the thought drifted as hunger surged back to the forefront. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Can you spare $1?" The woman paused mid-step, her head tilting slightly. For a moment, Roy regretted speaking. Maybe she'd ignore him like so many others. But then she turned. It was as if the world around them slowed. A few passers-by glanced at her, recognition dawning on their faces. The woman was Melania Trump, and she was walking toward him. But what happened next would defy everything Roy thought he knew about people like her. Roy's heart quickened. People like her didn't stop for people like him. Not the polished, not the wealthy, not the ones who lived in gilded towers far removed from the cracks in the sidewalk. But there she was, standing just feet away, lowering her sunglasses to meet his eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried an edge of curiosity that made him sit up straighter. "Roy," he croaked. He coughed to clear his throat. "Just Roy." She knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to his level. "Roy," she repeated, almost like she was testing the name. Then, to his shock, she reached into her coat pocket. A crisp dollar bill appeared between her fingers. She held it out, but before he could take it, she said, "If I give you this, will you tell me your story?" Roy blinked. His story? No one had ever asked that before. Most people tossed coins without a word, avoiding eye contact as if their generosity was a transaction to be done with quickly. But here she was, waiting patiently. He hesitated, his pride battling his desperation. "It's not much of a story," he muttered. "Just bad luck." "Let me decide that," Melania said with a small smile. The words spilled out before he could stop them. He spoke of the accident at the construction site, the medical bills that drowned him, the wife who couldn't handle the stress and left, and the daughter he hadn't seen in years. He told her about the shelters, the nights he spent clutching his belongings so they wouldn't get stolen, and the mornings he woke up wondering if he had the strength to keep going. Melania listened intently, her gaze never wavering. When he finished, she didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced at the dollar in her hand, then back at him. "Roy, you deserve more than this," she said finally. She reached into her bag and pulled out something that made him gasp. A checkbook. But Roy couldn't have imagined the words she was about to say. Roy stared at the checkbook, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if it was hunger or disbelief making his head spin. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice shaky. Melania met his gaze calmly. "I want to help you get back on your feet," she said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She began writing something on the check, her pen moving with deliberate strokes. Roy's skepticism flared. He had heard too many empty promises, seen too many hollow gestures from strangers who said they wanted to help, but never followed through. "Why me?" he blurted out. "You don't even know me." She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "I don't need to know you to see that you've been dealt a hard hand," she said. Sometimes life is about doing what you can for someone when you can. No questions, no conditions. The words hit him like a wave. His eyes flicked to the check as she tore it from the book and held it out. It was for $10,000. His breath caught. This can't be real, he stammered, his hands refusing to reach for it. It is, she replied firmly. But it's not charity, Roy. It's a chance. I'll connect you with someone who can help you find a place to stay and a job. The rest is up to you. Roy's hands trembled as he took the check. The edges of his vision blurred, tears he hadn't cried in years threatening to spill over. He tried to speak, but no words came. But just as hope began to flicker in his heart, a voice from the crowd cut through the moment. "Hey, is this some kind of PR stunt?" a man's voice called out from the growing crowd. Roy flinched, suddenly aware of the people gathering around them. Some had their phones out, cameras recording every second. A man in a leather jacket stepped forward, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Melania Trump handing out checks to homeless guys? Sounds too good to be true." Melania didn't flinch. She stood, adjusting her coat, and turned to face the man. "If you think helping someone is a stunt, maybe you should ask yourself why," she said, her voice steady but cutting. The crowd murmured, a mix of agreement and skepticism rippling through them. Roy felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, and shame crept up his spine. What if they thought he was part of some scheme? What if this moment of hope was snatched away? "I don't want trouble," Roy muttered, clutching the check to his chest. "If this is gonna cause a scene, I—" "Don't," Melania interrupted firmly, her gaze locking onto his. "Don't let anyone take this moment from you. They don't know your story, Roy." The man in the leather jacket scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Like you'd actually care about his story. This is just for show." Melania took a step toward him, her chin lifted high. "If helping one person gives others something to talk about, let them talk," she said. "But what have you done for someone today?" The man's face hardened, and he turned away, grumbling under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, still recording. Roy stood frozen, the check crumpled slightly in his grip. "Why'd you do that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the fading noise. She smiled faintly. "Because no one should be shamed for being shown kindness." But Roy couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was far from over. Roy sat on the curb, staring at the check as if it might vanish at any moment. Around him, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the life-changing moment unfolding on its streets. Melania stayed by his side, her presence both calming and surreal. "What am I supposed to do now?" Roy finally asked, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. "You start fresh," she replied. "But you don't have to do it alone." She pulled out her phone, tapping a few buttons before showing him a contact. "This is Maria. She works with an organization that helps people rebuild. She'll meet you tomorrow to talk about housing and jobs. I'll cover the costs to get you started." Roy's mind reeled. It felt too good to be true, and yet the sincerity in her voice made him believe, if only for a moment, that maybe this was real. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania hesitated, her eyes softening. "Because I know what it's like to feel powerless," she said, her words carrying a weight he didn't expect. "And because sometimes, a single moment of kindness can change everything." Roy looked down at the check again, his fingers tracing the edges. He didn't have the words to thank her. Not yet. All he could do was nod, overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay ahead. But as the night grew darker, Roy couldn't have predicted the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. By the next morning, Roy's story was everywhere. Videos of his interaction with Melania Trump had gone viral, flooding social media and news outlets alike. Some hailed her as a beacon of compassion. Others accused her of staging the encounter for publicity. Roy hadn't asked for any of it. He spent the night at a shelter Maria had arranged for him, trying to process the whirlwind his life had become. When he woke, reporters were already outside, their cameras and microphones waiting to capture every word he might say. "Roy, is it true Melania Trump gave you $10,000? Do you think she did it for attention? What are you going to do with the money? The questions came rapid fire, each one louder than the last. Roy's hands trembled as he tried to push past them, his head down. He didn't want this kind of attention. He just wanted to eat, sleep, and figure out how to piece his life back together. Later that afternoon, he met with Maria at a quiet diner on the outskirts of Fort Worth. She was kind and patient, walking him through his options for housing and employment. "You don't need to worry about the noise," she said, gesturing to the swarm of notifications on his borrowed phone. "It'll die down soon. Focus on what matters, your next step." Roy nodded, though the anxiety lingered. "I didn't ask for any of this," he admitted. "I just needed $1. Maria smiled gently. "Sometimes life gives us more than we expect. It's not about what you asked for, it's about what you do with it." That evening, Roy sat alone in his small motel room, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the past 3 years, the pain, the loneliness, the nights he'd wondered if anyone would ever see him as more than a shadow on the street. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of something new. But as the phone on his nightstand buzzed with another notification, Roy realized the hardest part was yet to come. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Offers began pouring in. Job opportunities, donations, even a spot on a morning talk show. People from all over the country wanted to know more about Roy's story. Some saw him as an inspiration, while others labeled him as someone who had lucked into an undeserved windfall. The attention was overwhelming. Roy found himself second-guessing every decision, every word he spoke. But what weighed on him most were the offers that came with strings attached. Appearances where he'd have to praise Melania publicly. Deals to sell his story to the highest bidder. Even a proposal from a major brand that wanted to use him as the face of their holiday campaign. It all felt wrong. The check Melania had given him was enough to rebuild his life, but now it felt like everyone wanted to take a piece of it. He met with Maria again, her steady presence keeping him grounded. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Maria leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "That's not for me to decide, Roy. But I will say this. Remember who you are and what matters to you. Don't let the noise drown that out." Her words stayed with him as he left the diner. The next morning, Roy made his decision. He declined the talk show appearances, refused the brand deals, and chose instead to focus on the basics, finding stable work and a place to call home. He wasn't interested in fame or fortune. He just wanted his life back. But as the media frenzy began to fade, Roy discovered that true change doesn't come without challenges. With Maria's help, Roy found a small apartment on the edge of Arlington and began working as an assistant at a local construction company. The work was steady and honest, and it reminded him of the life he had once known. He spent his evenings fixing up old furniture, something he hadn't done in years, and even began volunteering at the shelter where he had stayed that first night. The city still remembered him, though. Occasionally, strangers would approach him on the street, asking if he was the guy from the Melania video. He'd smile politely and keep walking, grateful that the attention had mostly died down. One afternoon, as he was leaving work, he noticed a familiar face standing near the entrance. It was Melania. She was dressed simply, without the air of grandeur that usually surrounded her. For a moment, Roy was stunned. "I came to see how you're doing," she said, smiling warmly. Roy hesitated, unsure what to say. "I'm doing okay," he finally managed. "Better than I was." "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. There was a pause, and then she added, "You've done well with the chance you were given. Not everyone would have." Roy shrugged. "I didn't do it alone." Melania's smile deepened. "No one does. But you made the choice to move forward. That's what matters." As she turned to leave, Roy called out, "Why me? Out of all the people you could have helped, why me?" She glanced back, her expression thoughtful. "Because kindness doesn't need a reason." And with that, she walked away, leaving Roy with a renewed sense of purpose. Roy's life wasn't perfect, but it was his again. He had a roof over his head, work he was proud of, and a community he cared about. The check from Melania had been the catalyst, but the real change came from within. He had chosen to take that chance and make it count. This story isn't just about Roy or Melania. It's about the power of a single act of kindness. It's about how a moment of compassion can ripple outward, creating opportunities for growth, connection, and understanding. Roy's journey reminds us that no matter how far someone has fallen, it's never too late to get back up. So, what about you? If you had the chance to change someone's life, even in the smallest way, would you take it? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to see the world differently.